Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. Have you ever had to choose between the past and the present? Between the love you once had and the future you're building? What if the person from your past suddenly reappeared, bringing with the memories you thought you had buried forever? How would you handle it if the man you loved deeply but lost asked for forgiveness and a second chance? Stay tuned as we dive into the emotional journey of Diep, James, and Pau. Who will Diep choose? And what secrets will unravel along the way? Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us as we reach 1,000 followers, because this story is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next. James sat in a quiet cafe, the dim streetlights casting shadows through the window, creating a serene yet heavy atmosphere. Lynn sat across from him, gently offering him a glass of lemonade, a friendly gesture that couldn't quite hide the tension between them. James, with his eyes lost in thought, gazed outside at the relentless autumn rain, which streaked the glass like the turmoil in his mind. "We're facing difficulties," James began, his voice low and full of concern. "Competition from new companies is growing. I feel like we need to change, but I don't know where to begin." Lynn listened carefully, then spoke softly. "Sir, I believe our company still has a solid position. What's crucial now is improving our marketing, not just relying on our reputation." James remained silent, his gaze still fixed outside the window. The rain seemed endless, just like his worries. Deep down, he understood that if they didn't act, nothing would ever change. But the weight of decisions ahead left him feeling uncertain. He was the leader, the one who had to steer the ship, but the storm he faced seemed overwhelming. The sound of raindrops tapping against the glass was the only thing that filled the silence between them. Lynn waited, knowing James needed time to process. Yet time was something James felt he no longer had, and the pressure of his responsibilities weighed heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling that their company's survival depended on a decision he hadn't made yet. Diep stood in the middle of the melon field, the golden light of the late afternoon gently caressing the ripe melons. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the quiet, and she turned. Her eyes widened, and there he stood, Pau, the man from her past, standing still like a shadow she had long forgotten, but could never fully escape. "Diep, is it really you?" Pau's voice trembled with a mixture of surprise and sorrow. Diep stared at him, frozen for a moment, before responding softly, her voice laced with unspoken emotion. "Pau, I didn't expect to see you again." They stood in silence, the breeze rustling the leaves around them, as if the world itself had paused. "How are you?" Pau asked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with longing and regret. Diep gave him a faint smile, her eyes reflecting the weight of memories. "I'm fine. Work is the same." The simplicity of her response didn't ease the heaviness in Pau's heart. The years apart had carved deep changes in both their lives, yet at that moment, nothing seemed to have changed between them. "I've quit drinking," Pau said quietly, looking down as if the admission itself carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. "My life is different now." Diep stood motionless, her heart torn. She couldn't find the words to respond, nor could she explain the conflicting emotions rising within her. She had moved on, hadn't she? Yet, seeing him now, the remnants of their past seemed to rush back in waves. He hadn't changed, not entirely. Perhaps she hadn't either. The conversation lingered in the still air between them, like the hum of distant memories, faint but persistent. Diep glanced down at the basket of melons she was holding, as though searching for an answer in the simple task of picking fruit. The soft afternoon sunlight bathed them both in a golden hue, the warmth of the moment making everything feel oddly close yet distant. "I've changed, Diep," Pao spoke again, his voice more earnest this time. "I thought I could move on. Thought maybe the money would fix things, but I was wrong." He paused, searching for the words to express what had been buried deep within him. "I left everything behind, even my past, because I couldn't find a way forward. I came here, to the hills, to try to live without the weight of who I was." Diep remained silent, her heart heavy. She had always known that Pao was not a lost cause, but hearing him admit it so openly stirred something in her, a recognition of the man he had been and the one he might become. "It sounds like you found peace," she said softly, but there was a sadness in her words. "I'm glad for you, Pao. I really am." But Pao wasn't finished. His voice trembled as he continued. "And you, Diep, are you happy now, with James?" His eyes searched hers, as though looking for the answer in her face, but she was not ready to give it. Diep's eyes darted away, her mind swirling. "James is kind, Pao," she said carefully, "but there's a part of me that still wonders about the life we could have had. Could we have been happy?" Pao nodded slowly, understanding more than he let on. "You deserve happiness, Diep. I failed you, and I understand if you can't forgive me for that. But just know this, I'm no longer the man I was." They stood in silence again, the weight of their past hanging in the air, neither of them truly knowing where to go from here. The evening had settled in quietly as Diep walked home. Her thoughts, once again, were consumed with the lingering conversation with Pao. It felt like an ache in her chest, one that had never quite healed. She had built a life with James, one that she thought was filled with peace, but her mind kept drifting back to the man she had once loved. When she arrived home, James was waiting for her on the porch, looking out over the land. The sight of him, standing there quietly, brought a wave of warmth to her heart. He had always been there for her, even when she struggled with herself. The moment she stepped closer, he turned toward her, his face softening in relief. "How was the harvest?" he asked, his voice filled with care. But Diep could hear the undercurrent of concern that he always held for her. "It was good," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Everything's fine, James." But James could tell there was more in her voice, a shadow he could not ignore. He stepped toward her, taking her hands in his. "Diep, what's on your mind? You've been distant lately." Diep hesitated, unsure how to begin. The weight of Pao's words still lingered in her mind. She couldn't bring herself to tell James about the momentary crack in her heart, the doubts she had been carrying. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "I'm just tired, that's all." James studied her face closely, his eyes searching for the truth. He had always known her better than she sometimes realized, but he also understood when to give her space. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here. You don't have to hide anything from me." The sincerity in his voice struck a chord deep within her. She wanted to tell him everything, but how could she explain the confusion she felt? How could she make him understand that, despite everything, Pao still held a part of her heart? As James reached out to kiss her forehead, Diep closed her eyes, allowing herself a brief moment of comfort. For now, that was enough. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the hills, casting long shadows across the fields where Diep worked. It was the kind of peaceful day that seemed to promise nothing more than routine. Yet for Pao, it felt as if the earth itself was urging him to make a final decision. He found himself standing at the edge of the road, watching Diep from a distance as she carried baskets of melons to the market. His heart ached, not for himself but for her, the woman who had loved him, who had suffered alongside him, and now stood at the crossroads of her life, caught between the past and the present. When Diep spotted him, her face changed, though she quickly masked her emotions. "Pao," she said softly, "I didn't expect to see you again today." Pao stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I know," he replied, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "But I had to see you, Diep. I had to tell you. I'm sorry for everything. For the way I treated you, for the way I ran away from everything." His words were raw, a confession he had carried far too long. "I've changed. I want to make things right, even if we can't be what we once were." Diep remained silent for a moment, her thoughts tangled between the love they once shared and the man he had become. "Pao, you don't need to apologize," she said quietly. "The past is behind us now. We both have moved on." But Pao wasn't convinced. "Have we really?" he asked. "Because when I see you, Diep, I still see the woman I once loved, and I can't forget her." His voice cracked slightly, but he continued. "I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I am sorry. I never stopped thinking about you." Tears welled in Diep's eyes, but she held them back, forcing a smile. "I've moved on, Pao. I've built a new life now. I found peace in a way that I never did with you." Pao nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken words between them. The love they had was no longer enough to bridge the gap between who they were then and who they had become. He had hoped for a different answer, but the truth was undeniable. He was too late. "I just want you to be happy," Pao said softly, before turning away. "I hope James makes you happy, Diep. You deserve that." And with that, he walked away, leaving her with a bittersweet smile, a memory of love that had once been real but could never be rekindled. The evening arrived quickly, and with it came the stillness that often followed a long, emotional day. James sat by the fire, the flames dancing softly in the hearth. He watched Diep as she sat beside him, her face pale, her eyes distant. It had been a long time since he had seen her so quiet, and it troubled him more than he cared to admit. "Diep," James began, his voice gentle but filled with concern. "I've been noticing that something's bothering you. You don't have to keep it inside. Whatever it is, we can face it together." Diep glanced at him, her heart heavy with a secret she wasn't ready to share. But as James looked at her, with that unwavering love in his eyes, she knew she couldn't keep pretending. "James, there's something I need to tell you," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I met Pao again yesterday. He came to the farm." James didn't react immediately, but the tension in his body was palpable. "I see," he said quietly. "And what happened?" Diep took a deep breath. "He apologized to me. He's changed, James. He's sober now, and he wants to make amends for everything he did. He still cares for me, James. I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I couldn't keep it from you." James remained silent, his eyes never leaving hers. His mind raced, processing what she had just said. He had known that Pao had been part of her past, but hearing this truth hit him harder than he expected. "I know it's hard for you to understand," Diep continued, her voice breaking, "but I needed to tell you. I needed to be honest with you because you deserve the truth." James reached out and gently took her hand. "I understand, Diep. I know he was part of your past, and I know you've been through a lot with him. But what matters now is what we have, what we're building together." Tears welled in Diep's eyes, and she leaned into him, seeking comfort. "I don't want to hurt you, James, but I also don't want to lie to you." James pressed his forehead to hers, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to forget your past, Diep, but I want you to be here with me now. That's all that matters." They sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling between them. Diep had shared the truth, and now it was time to let go of the past and embrace what lay ahead. For both of them, the future was uncertain, but together they would face whatever came next. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one more difficult than the last. Diep spent her time working on the farm, keeping busy with the tasks at hand, but her mind was never truly at peace. The conversation with James still echoed in her thoughts, and the unresolved feelings for Pao lingered like an invisible weight on her chest. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Diep stood by the window in their small farmhouse. The fields outside were bathed in the soft light of dusk, and for a moment, everything felt still, like time had frozen. James stepped into the room, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor. He had been quiet lately, sensing the turbulence within her, but never pressing her to speak. He had always been patient, understanding. But now, as he stood behind her, he finally broke the silence. "Diep," he said softly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I need to know where we stand. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine if there's something still weighing on your heart." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and resolve. "James, I care for you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But there's something inside me that still isn't settled. Something I thought I had left behind, but it's been haunting me." James reached for her hand, his touch gentle, yet firm. "I don't want to push you, Diep, but I need you to be honest with me. If you're still thinking about him, about your past, I can't pretend it doesn't hurt." The silence between them was heavy, thick with emotions neither of them could put into words. Diep closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. The love she had for James was real, deep, and unwavering, but the memories of Pao were not something she could easily erase. "I don't know what to do, James," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to choose between the life I have with you and the memories of what once was, but I can't ignore how I feel either." James squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to choose, Diep. What we have, it's real. The past will always be a part of us, but we can't live there. We can only move forward." Diep nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe in the future they could build together, but the path to it seemed so uncertain. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She had to let go, not just of Pao, but of the part of herself that clung to the past. She needed to make peace with her choices, with the love she had found in James, and with the man she had once loved. I'm here, James, she said, her voice steady now, her heart finally at peace. I've made my choice. James smiled, a quiet relief in his eyes. And I'll be here, Diep. Always. They stood there for a long while, hands intertwined, as the last rays of the sun disappeared beneath the horizon. The future, uncertain as it was, no longer felt so daunting. Together they would face it, one step at a time.
Diệp sau khi ly hôn với Bao đã tìm được sự bình yên bên James, một người đàn ông tốt và yêu thương cô. Tuy nhiên, khi Bao trở lại và bày tỏ sự hối hận về quá khứ, Diệp phải đối mặt với cảm giác khó xử giữa tình yêu cũ và tình yêu hiện tại. Bao sau khi bỏ rượu và thay đổi cuộc sống, thừa nhận vẫn còn yêu Diệp và xin lỗi vì những lỗi lầm trước đây. Diệp mặc dù có những cảm xúc lẫn lộn, quyết định đặt niềm tin vào James và chấp nhận cuộc sống hiện tại. Cô nhận ra rằng dù quá khứ vẫn còn trong lòng, cô cần phải tiến về phía trước và giữ lấy tình yêu đích thực.